Well, good afternoon, everybody, and I'd like to welcome you to this session of our. If we get started with this, I want to acknowledge Lynn Robertson, who was curator at what is called the UWF Historic Trust now. She developed this webinar a year or two back for one of our other workshops, and we are using it sort of as the basis today because she had such good information in it. And we're updating it a little bit, and I just want to acknowledge her as we start here. Basically, part of developing emergency plans has to do with priorities, and for me there are really two kinds of priorities. There are what I call priority before an emergency and priority afterward, and I want to cover a little bit on both sides. Before the emergency, these activities can be prioritized in terms of activities you can identify to prevent problems and mitigate them. Elise touched on some of these in her threats, and I think that as part of an emergency planning while you develop the plan is that you can anticipate some of these kinds of things and put them into your plan. Of course, we talk about hurricane, tropical storms often threaten Florida, and thankfully today with all of our advances in weather forecasting, we at least know that they're coming, and we generally have a few days of planning before them. So knowing the kinds of threats they bring, rain and wind, and in other threats, we can mitigate some of these. Sometimes you can't anticipate the planning, well, therefore your emergency planning should include what I call anticipation plan, and that is activities you can do to prevent and mitigate a disaster. The photograph in this one is one that was not anticipated, and this is a picture of the flooding of Tulane University Library by Hurricane Katrina. And along the Gulf Coast, many of us never anticipated that a hurricane would push an enormous flood of water into it, and it would inundate the Gulf Coast and those kind of things. So we all know that there are things that we cannot anticipate, but hopefully before the emergency, we can do things to mitigate such things or identify them. Now, focusing on some of the things that we can do before the emergency, we've done a little bit of that today already in our discussion, and that is identifying the threats to people, to the users, and to the collections. And we've talked about some of those threats. Some of these threats can be unique to your own facility, so if we're planning, you need to identify these kind of things. Of course, we all talk about fire, flooding, vandalism, broken window, being in basements, that kind of thing. But if you can try to identify the major threats to people, users, and collection, that will help you. Also, a part of emergency planning should be what protection for people, users, and collection are in place now. What kinds of things are you doing? What kinds of things do you already have so that you can help in your plan to understand what you can do with these things? Are there areas for improvement? And that's always a good thing. And we've already talked about some. We're going to be talking about a few more of those things later on in this talk. But of course, I'm talking about mitigation activity. In terms of priority, your mitigation should be before the event. Now, emergency people will tell you that the rule of thumb is that people and the lives of people come first, and collection and stuff, as they'll call it, come second. Now, that's really hard to hear when you're a librarian, an archivist, a museum curator, because most of us have a passion for what we do, and we spend our entire life taking care of the unique material and collections that are under our custody because we want to preserve them for future generations. And so hearing some of these professional personnel tell us that people are first and collections and our stuff is second is, like I say, very hard to hear. One of the best things that you can do before an emergency is to ask your staff to discuss where they see issues. And that is, are there issues you haven't thought of? And it should be all staff, especially volunteer, user, custodial staff, and others. For example, and sometimes it's important to go through all the layers of people. To give you an example, at the university I'm at, I had a public event a year back at our conference center, and it was in the evening, and it was dark. And about an hour before the event, I realized that the pathway from the parking lot to the conference center had no lighting. They were cobblestone bricks. They were slick with water, and I ran to the Target store and got a couple of flashlights, and had some students out there helping people direct them into the building. I wrote a memo the next day to our facility people and said, this is a problem, this needs lighting, there needs to be floodlight on the building, people can see the words conference center and so forth. And it took a year and a half, but they finally got those installed. And so one of the problems, I think, is that you need to talk to all the staff, and it may take time to get things out of people, but you need to have issues. You need to know about them. The library I work at, there are janitorial closets on each floor of the building. Some years ago, some of our staff noticed the smell of spaghetti in the library. We didn't know where it was coming from. Turned out one of the janitor closets, they'd installed a hot plate, and they were cooking lunches up there for the janitor, and we had to call them on that kind of thing. But that's what I mean. You need to ask your staff what's going on. You need to get an idea from them of things and ideas that they should talk about. You should have an existing policy and habit of a periodic check of your facility. And the reason for that is try to solve problems before they are big ones. In other words, are there leaks? Are there things that can be fixed? Are there things that maybe you can't be fixed, but you need to know about them? In other words, try to make a periodic check. Lynn, who worked with a lot of historic buildings, recommended they walk through these buildings at least once a month just to see if there were any issues or problems, or maybe someone had tried to jimmy a lock, or there were scratches or leaks or other kinds of things. And sometimes when you work with these facilities day in and day out, it becomes hard to do that. Another priority before an emergency, you need to double check your alarm system, make sure that it works. Is it working? Does it need new battery? Do you have battery? It should be tested. Do all the staff know how to, if you have an alarm system, do all the staff know how to arm it and disarm it? Are there visible labels of what company to contact if you need to? Do you have the information away from the facility? It does you no good to have all this information at the facility and you have an emergency and can't get to it. Well, you need to provide for that. You need to have all kinds of information away from the facility. Staff at home should have ways of contacting everybody. You should have cell phone numbers. You should have landline. You should have all kinds of information away from the facility. Do you have smoke detectors? Do they work? Do they need batteries? Have they been tested? Other areas that you should have them but don't exist. That becomes part of your emergency plan in terms of planning. Do the staff know where the water cutoff valves are? If you have water or natural gas or AC or furnace unit, do you just depend on someone else to take care of that for you? That might not be good enough in an emergency. You might be the only one there. What about volunteers? Do they know where these things are? Are there do you have manuals and things off-site as well as maybe by the unit, for example? Emergency, do you have flammable chemicals stored on the site? Do you, where, how, who has access to them? Fire extinguisher, fire control, sprinkler system. Part of your priorities and planning are these in place? Do they work? Do the staff know where the extinguishers are? Do you know how to use them? Do you know how to shut off sprinkler system, for example? Are the alarm systems been tested? What kind of fire extinguishers do you have? If you're in a museum, sometimes people put in fire extinguishers that have chemical foam, and that chemical foam might cause greater damage to your artifact wood surfaces as well as to archival and manuscript materials and rare books than, say, a plain water extinguisher. Another priority before an emergency is you really need to cultivate a relationship with the police and fire departments. You need to get them involved in what you do. In the case of the university I'm at, we have had active shooter training in our library. We closed down for an afternoon and had the police come in and do active drills as well as training. Fire departments. We also have had fire departments come through. We discovered that we had a kind of a gap in our emergency plan because we had a rule that all the staff in the library, when the fire alarm went off, would get together at another spot outside of the building. That way you could make a list of everybody was out of the building. But the problem is that once everybody left the building, there was no one at the front to stop students from going in, and the students seemed to ignore the fire alarm while they were running. So we had to do that. In my case, I have one of the few keys to the archive department. I locked it when I left. Fire people will tell you leave all the doors unlocked when you leave a building. I'm a curator or custodian. I am not going to do that. I locked up my department. Since I have one of the few keys, if they need to get in, I need to stick around where I'm available. So you have to do those kind of planning and priority before an emergency. And I'm going through all these kind of things because I want you to think about them as you work on the emergency plan. For your building, you need to check for vulnerability, have your building inspected. How old is the roof? They're loose and cork board, rotted window sills. Do the doors open and shut properly? Are there cracked and sagging plaster? The gutters and downspouts cleaned? Pensacola, we had a really unique problem this year. It was an emergency we could not have anticipated, but we got 26 inches of rain in 24 hours. A rainstorm came in, just sat down and didn't move. We had flooding problems around Pensacola like you wouldn't believe, and because it was springtime, it was April, people had not cleaned out gutters and downspouts and things drained regularly. We just had flooding horribly. So this is something you need to do. Is the wiring in good shape in your building? Has the HVAC system been serviced? Are the drain pipes clear? I've had my own personal experience. I've had leaks in my house because the drain pipe from my HVAC got clogged up and that type of thing. Is there plumbing in good shape? These are all things that you need to check on a regular basis or maybe annually. Does your building meet current hurricane standards? Now, those have been upgraded a lot since some of the last hurricanes in the last 10 years. It's been 10 years since a hurricane struck the Panhandle of Pensacola. There's a lot of people in the area that have never been through a hurricane. There are a lot of homes that have not been upgraded. Do you have emergency supplies on hand? Does your staff know where they are? It's staff training that's very, very important to do. Sometimes, and the training is important because sometimes maybe it's only your volunteer that can get to your facility in an emergency. Do they know where things are? Do they have contact information? So training of the staff, and especially new staff and other staff, is very important. And these are all things that you need to do to prepare behind the scenes before the season starts. Make sure no collection touching walls, raise collection 2 inches off the floor, cover storage stack area shelving with plastic if needed be, because our role is to protect the collection. We also have to check the grounds around our facility. Are there hazards? Emergencies are not just disaster emergencies. Emergency can be emergency where you have visitors and staff trip over something or fall on something or cut their hand on something because you haven't maintained the area, you haven't looked at the area. We talked about fires here during our threats. Do you have a fire break around your facility? Do you have to trees trimmed back and other kinds of things? Mitigation should include people. You need to post floor plan with exit routes in all workspaces and public places. We discovered one year that our floor plans in the library were really nice. They were pasted by the elevators. You're not supposed to use the elevator in a disaster, or if the power goes out. When the power goes out, there wasn't enough light to read the floor plans anyway because they were printed in dark color. And so we have to relook at that. We need to train staff to take evacuation orders seriously. You need to train your tour guide and volunteer to know at least 2 ways out of a building, especially if you're giving tours and you have visitors coming to your area. You should consider first aid, CPR training for your staff via the Red Cross, and they should be, when you should have people that you should regularly undertake this kind of training. Now I come to kind of priorities with the collections. We one of the reasons we're in this field is because we have rare and unique materials in our facility. For museums, those can be objects, painting, key documentation files. I'm going to keep emphasizing this. Documentation files are those files you've maintained inside about each of the collection, and that is paperwork donating your title transfer, your ownership, copyright ownership, agreement with donors, agreement with other people. These are often considered the office records of your museum or your archive or your historical site, but they are very important and they are key things that you should have. Libraries and archives, there'll be key collections, there'll be rare items, rare books, same kind of documentation file. Historical files, historic house museums, there's going to be key objects that you may have, paintings, archival collections, documentation files, and even working files. Among these kind of documentation files, especially for places that have objects, would be things like inventory, pictures of the item, description, kinds of things you would need to provide to an insurance company if you had a problem or a disaster after the fact. And it goes without saying that before the fact you should have gone through your museum and objects and documented them. Fortunately, today with your smartphones and your cameras, that's kind of an easier, you can do that on a very quick basis, and you can have the equipment to save them. Now, priorities, determining what to save before a disaster and even afterwards. Determining what to save are several factors: the rarity or the uniqueness of the item, the value, that is the information value or the monetary value. Give me an example of informational. The university does maintain and work with a Pensacola committee called the Architectural Review Board. People are supposed to file with the Architectural Review Board any change they make to a house or structure in any of the historic districts. Those files become very crucial for determining what things look like and so forth. So they're not monetarily value, but they're informational value, and very determining what you will say will also be crucial to your mission of your facility and your institution. Now, there's several emergency planning issues here. One, of course, before an emergency, identification and storage. Anticipation is how to save. How to save things. Would you wrap things up before an emergency? Would you move things away from a window and you wrap them up carefully and store them? Other kinds of things. How to save an object. And in a recovery, what item would draw your first attention? If you had really a major flooding issue, what important item would you concentrate on first? Now, one of the issues that comes up in priorities is loans, and loan might be a special priority on your decision. Loan agreements typically contain a clause that says that you, as the borrower, will exercise the same care for a loan as your permanent collection. And if you did not save that collection and that was wiped out, you might really run into a public relation nightmare with somebody that loaned you something and you didn't save that. You saved something else. So that's something to take into consideration in your anticipation and your planning. And priority for collection objects: if the object is replaceable, that is it a mass-produced item? Is it important to your mission? Lynn liked to talk about a favorite object we have in Pensacola, and that is the Wentworth Museum that donated all their objects to the university. He had a thing called a mummified cat, and it was a corpse of a cat that had been discovered inside a building when they remodeled, and the cat had sort of kind of been mummified, and he had that on display in his museum, and people would leave and they would talk about the mummified cat. Well, even today, people come into that museum and they ask about the mummified cat. So is that something you would say? Is it important to your mission? Is the kind of thing, the first thing the reporter would ask after a disaster, did you save the mummified cat? And if you said no, how would that impact your public relations? So you have to think about things like that. In other words, that's an object that's popular with your users. For collection objects, you also have to consider in priority what condition is it in? Was it restored? Would you use it seriously? Especially after a disaster, what is the condition? Would you restore it? Would you use it again? Also, in protecting the object before the item, are they susceptible to damage, to water, mold, and other kinds of things? For archival collection, the question comes up, which collection do you save? In other words, the hurricane is 3 days out, which collection do you save? Decision-making might be tempered about what has been copied, digitization, microfilm, and etc. I have massive newspaper files at the University of West Florida. I can't tell you how heavy these things are, but the idea of moving them all out of harm's way just is really frightening, I guess, and maybe impossible. And so maybe if they already exist on microfilm, they might be the lowest on your priority. Pre-planning might mitigate your prioritizing. In other words, where are the items stored? How are they stored? And where are they stored? In terms of documentation, I've already mentioned that the priority might be to preserve those kinds of records, donor file, deeds of gift, transfers, loan agreement. Annual reports can be very, very important to say because within annual reports, you generally report kinds of gifts and types of collection you had. For archive, of course, collection inventories, list of the material. Some of the collection inventory may only exist in your repository. There are choices and choices and choices. This exercise might give you a kind of an opportunity to think about some of these things, to develop action plans. For example, digitization of the donor records in the documentation file. That might come to the top of your priority list now in your emergency planning because it would be something that you could by digitization, you could back up and or off-site make available. Do you centralize important and unique items? This is called the red box theory. Archivists have debated this for years, the idea of the red box. In other words, taking the unique things in your archive, that autographed letter, an important autographed letter, that original document by George Washington, that item signed by Abraham Lincoln, putting them all into a special marked red box or something so that if you had to save one item, you could grab that box and run out of the facility. The problem is that in many cases, by creating the red box and identifying it, if somebody's going to rob you, that's the first thing they're going to take is the most valuable box. And so there's been a big debate in archives about whether this is possible and whether this is even possible at all. Now, with an archive, it's possible because you simply make a photocopy of the original item, you put that in the collection where it belongs, and you put a note that says if the person wants to see the original thing, see the archivist, and they retrieve it from the red box. If you have a collection like large as I have, your red box turns into a file cabinet, which is probably not even movable either. And so these are issues that you're going to have to think about. Do you make preventative decisions based on storage? And for example, nothing stored on the floor, shelving raised, waterproof containers. I did have a case from 20 years ago at my university where I had a call at 1:30 in the morning. They said water was pouring into the basement from the ceiling. I went out there. I had a row of about 24 boxes that were stacked 4 high across the floor. I had to move all 3 of the boxes at the top of each file to get to the box that was sitting in water on the floor, take all those materials out, dry them, that kind of thing. After that, we raised everything off the floor. And it'll take one disaster to teach you, hey, maybe I shouldn't do that. But if you know a hurricane coming, you're going to see me walk around, make sure that nothing's on the floor, everything is raised off the floor. That's part of mitigation and part of a priority. Also, in your emergency plan and prioritizing collection, you have to think about, like I say, the threat. You have to identify what the threat is to help you determine and what will direct your attention to different kinds of things. Setting priority is going to be really unique to each of you. Library today, with the onset of digitization of books and many things being online, so many of the books that individual libraries had are often not unique anymore. The information can be found in other forms. So your attention might be to what we call the top of the list. That is, books where your library only have one of 10 known copies, or your book happens to be autographed, or it has some local connection or something like that. Every situation is going to be a little different depending on your facility and on the kinds of collections that you're trying to preserve. And I think I'll stop there. That gives you a little bit of idea, gives you some ideas on developing priority. Again, I think the priority can be defined before an emergency, and that is part of your planning. They can be defined in anticipation of emergency when you know something is coming. You have a recognizable threat like a hurricane or a tropical storm or a distant forest fire that's coming your way. I do know in Iran in Iraq during some of the recent things, and in Syria, some of the museums have moved their objects and transported them away from their facilities as they were being invaded by ISIS. Sometimes there are just things that you can do, and they're going to pertain to your own particular institution. So I'll stop there and ask, are there any questions or that I can answer?
This is Miriam. Thanks, Dean, for a really terrific presentation. And I'm looking around the room here. Are there questions in some of the other,
Hi, this is Robin down in South Florida, and we have a question from one of our mentees for Dean. Hi, Dean. This is Natasha. I have just a kind of a hypothetical. What if you have a priority permanent collection piece and a priority loan piece? What do you do? What if you had to choose one of what are the other?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Mm-hmm. Okay. What if you have a priority permanent collection piece and a priority loan piece, and you had to choose one of the two? How would you make that sort of decision?
That's going to depend on your own institution. I think that's hard to answer. I think what you have to do, I think you have to sit down and set up a kind of a pyramid for yourself on paper. In other words, the top being what collections are the most crucial and the most important and the most used, that kind of thing. And I think you can do that. Now, I'm in love with all of my collections. Okay, I have 850 collections at the university. Okay, and yes, I'm in love with all of my collections. But I would have to sit down and say which ones are the most crucial, which ones are the most useful, which ones are perhaps the most unique. I think those are all things you have to sit down and you kind of have to wrestle with. Another way you might think about it is, let's say you have nothing that is cataloged and nothing that was inventoried, and somebody showed up on your doorstep with plenty of money and plenty of staff, and they said to you, okay, we want to catalog your collection. What's the most important thing you would catalog right now? And maybe that might help you with that. I think there's a lot of considerations that are going to have to come into play. If you have an oil painting collection, which of those oil paintings are the most special and unique? Maybe they're work by famous artists. Maybe they are famous artists that visited your area, or maybe you would skip the ones that were given to you every year by the local art fair or something like that. I don't know. It's hard to answer your question, but I think if you think of it in terms of a pyramid, in terms of the most important things, I think that might benefit you.
This is Robin again. I'm just going to add to Dean's comment that oftentimes the loan agreement will kind of tell you what you need to do in cases when an emergency is coming, and oftentimes those loan items take top priority because they're not yours. So you have to call the institution you borrowed them from if you see, like, let's say a hurricane coming, and say, okay, what do you want us to do? You know what I mean? We can shelter in place. We can try to get it up to you, which probably won't work, but you really need to talk to that loaning institution first and keep them abreast of everything that's going on, because they might not know. So, but that's something you really have to consider when looking at kind of building your priorities at your museum.
That also may be kind of one of the hardest phone calls you have to make too, because a person might feel that some people would feel like, hey, you're watching out for my collection. Other people might feel like you are kind of turning the tables, and maybe they want the material agreement is and who the loaning institution is. I mean, if I put up a display and I borrowed an original George Catlin Indian portrait from the Smithsonian on on a 3-month exhibit to show off, that certainly would be a priority for me to get that into safety somehow.
This is Miriam, and I'll add in the question of, do you preserve your own collection first, or do you preserve those loan objects first? In the museum field, which might be a little different than special collections and libraries and archives, the rule of thumb is that you preserve other people's collections, that you really give them a priority because they have been entrusted to you on a temporary basis. The other thing to make sure that you are keenly aware of is what has been stipulated in the loan agreement, because the loan agreement might be very clear about some of the things that you are supposed to be doing and have agreed to do. So make sure that you refresh yourself on what's in the loan agreement, that obviously you have signed the loan agreement, or your institution has signed the loan agreement, understanding what's in the loan agreement, but if you see a disaster is on its way, that you refresh your memory about what might be in that loan agreement. So that was a great question. Thank you very much for asking it. Other questions?
Question is, how do you pare down or put together your priorities when you're in love with your whole collection? Or you have 5 different ideas of what should be priorities? Yeah, like 5 curators fighting over which one should be priority.
I think that's hard to answer. I think if there were 5 curators, I would divide the responsibilities among them and make each one responsible for identifying those things in their custody or that they oversee as the priority. I don't think you should be sitting around a table with 5 people and say, okay, who's in favor of saving the petrified cat? All right. Oh, the vote is 3-2. Are you lost? I don't think that's your answer. I think your answer is to each curator should have. I can't imagine they don't each one have a certain area that they're responsible for. In other words, this is your curator of paintings and art, and this is your curator of something else. I think the list should be put together, but I don't think they should be necessarily voted upon as a group. It's going to depend. Again, it's going to depend on your own individual situation. My reason for going through these is to make you think about them. I don't have all the answers. I don't think anyone does. But the idea is to make you think about what would you do and how would you establish priority. And I think it is impossible. I think you could make a list of which things are the most important in your given situation.
Thanks for that answer, Dean. This is Miriam in West Florida, and I've got a question for you from here.
Hi, Dean. Your presentation works on a couple presuppositions. One, that we know that the disaster or the emergency is going to occur, and 2, that we are going to have people willing to put themselves at harm's risk to save things. So I'm wondering where we juggle the line between protecting our objects or our documents and protecting our employees and ourselves if the threat is really imminent, and then keeping in mind that this stuff is insured. And although it may not be replaceable, there are equivalents and there is a cash value assigned to it.
Well, I think the question, we would not be talking about emergency planning for archives, museums, library, but we were not really concerned with the collection. And so I think our viewpoint at this point in time is trying to protect our collection, devising emergency plan. I certainly would not be in favor of putting staff in harm's way, but I think it's going to depend on the situation. If the best thing you can do is to do as much mitigation as possible, then Well, to give you an example, in hurricanes, a lot of times people will evacuate. And I don't think you have to insist that your staff and your volunteer remain in the area to take care of the facility if it's a life-threatening situation. Same thing true with fires and so forth. But sometime after the emergency, then the question in your emergency plan is going to come up as to who checks on things, who makes temporary repairs, who provides some security and other kinds of things. It's going to depend on the nature of the disaster. It's going to depend on the nature of your facility. In terms of insurance, I don't know that many places. Some places do have insurance. Many places do not. The insurance industry has fairly rigorous standards for insuring historical objects. I mean, they really want you to prove into the object and its condition, getting appraisal and that kind of thing. Those are very expensive processes. I'm not sure that a lot of museums and areas have them. It might be a good part of your emergency planning to touch with your insurance company and say how, if we are faced with an emergency, what is your view that we should handle? How should we handle our collection? Are there things that we should save? It might be a good base to touch base with them on something like that. But I would not advocate putting staff in harm's way. I think it just depends on the individual situation. In my case, I live close to the university. I can get to the university. After Hurricane Ivan, they wouldn't even allow me on campus because I wasn't on the approved list. When they did finally let me on the campus and I visited my archive, everything was fine, except it was 95 degrees because somebody in our physical plant decided that the best way to dry off the campus after a hurricane with a lot of water was to raise the temperature of every building on campus up to 95 degrees, and the water would dry off and everybody would be perfectly happy. And they had no idea that the heat might cause even worse problems than the water as far as mold and that kind of thing. I think staff have to be present at a museum, or especially after a disaster, for a disaster recovery, those kind of things. It's hard. You just have to strike some kind of balance between the two. I belong to a volunteer organization that also oversees a historic house. After every time we've had a hurricane or a tropical storm, we've had volunteers, members of our society, willing to go to the place and check it out, physically walk around and so forth. And a lot of organizations, you're going to have volunteers, you're going to have people that are passionate about saving the place as you are, and those people are going to remain in place. And that's why it's important to have information on your staff and your people and your cell phones and your email and all that kind of thing away from the facility as well. It's a good question. I just don't have a lot of answers to it.
This is Miriam, and I'm going to respond, Johnny, to your comments that there's an assumption that we know the disaster is coming. And I think implied in what you said is that there are a lot of disasters that we don't know are coming. And I'm going to argue that one of the reasons we do these training sessions is that we know disasters are coming. And the more you have prepared for them, the more easily you will respond to them. The mantra in emergency planning is practice, 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 so that you're doing this stuff in your sleep, so that your staff know exactly what their role is, and that your staff have a fundamental understanding amongst themselves about the fact that it is not appropriate to put each other in harm's way, and that as an institution, you would never expect someone to save the Rembrandt to put their life at risk, or to risk injury to themselves to save and whatever the great work of art, whatever the great collection item might be. At no time is the expectation that staff will be harmed. I mean, the first and foremost is no harm to staff, no harm to visitors, and then come in assess the situation and take the right steps. But I think that part of the purpose of this training is to say that the mere fact of having identified potential threats and then your response to those threats. And of course, we're not going to do all of this work today.
Miriam, we have one more question here. Can we go ahead and do one more question?
Go ahead, Dean. Yes.
Yeah, hi Miriam, this is Bert Altman. This was just a comment in terms of planning for an emergency, and this has been used in various libraries that have special collections department. There is color-coded reflective tape that actually can be put up on the shelves for those items that have been, determined to be really critical. If the power goes out and people come in to try to get these things out of there, that's been proven to be helpful. Just wanted to mention that.
Thanks a lot, Bert. That was a really good suggestion, and I think I certainly was not aware of it, so thank you. Françoise, do you want to add something here? And I'm going to assume that some of you might not have heard Françoise's comment, which is that the simple act of identifying your 10 most important objects means that you will pay attention to how they're stored, and that maybe you will consider not putting all 10 in the same room or on the same shelf, because if there is a disaster, then if they are in different places, or if you are transporting them or loaning them, that you will take into consideration what percentage of the most critical items in your collection are in harm's way at any given moment. And I think that that sense that identifying your most important items, I know from the work that we did in the previous Connecting to Collections project in 2012 on identifying emergency items, I know that a lot of people really struggled with making those decisions on behalf of their institutions, and in some case brought in board members or governing authority to arrive at consensus about what those most important items were. And of course, once you've done that and you go back to the governing authority or the board member or your boss or the dean or whomever and say, you agreed that these were our most important items. We now need some funding, we need some help, we need some effort to help preserve them, because we've now recognized why these items are of value to our organization and to our community.